The Chinese President Xi Jinping was in Saudi Arabia recently. What a trip that was, and what a reception he received. At the same time, there were two words that describe the reason for his trip. One, more important for him, the yuan. The other, the dollar. These two went head to head, indirectly. How did that happen, and why is that important? That's what we're going to cover in this edition of Economic Divide. Coming up in this program, Xi in Saudi Arabia, proposing oil to be paid in the yuan. That is a direct threat to the Petro dollar payment system. At the same time, it will weaken the dollar grip on trade. Next, Saudi Arabia's response to Xi Jinping. Well, the Crown Prince agreed to the payments in yuan. China wants to trade also in yuan, aside from oil and gas sales. The U.S. economy, as a result, will be threatened. Next, the U.S. position weakened overall. Why? The move away from the dollar will always weaken the U.S.'s position, and that's what's transpiring. The U.S. counter-reaction? And also, other West Asian nations, will they follow the Saudi lead?
China is now an emerging global power that's reshaping global economic relations. U.S. officials in various administrations have been concerned with what they describe as the rise of China. Beijing is now flexing its muscle in areas where the U.S. had traditionally been counted as an unmatched rival. China has decided to get close to Persian Gulf Arab states in what appears to be a direct confrontational move against the U.S. Furthermore, China is dictating its own rules in the merging business ties there. Earlier in December 2022, China's President Xi Jinping met high-ranking Saudi officials and other Persian Gulf Arab leaders to boost business ties and oil relations between China and Arab states. What's more important is the fact that China and Saudi Arabia are planning to trade their oil in China's national currency, the yuan. The talks with China over yuan-priced oil contracts have been off and on for 6 years, but have accelerated this year. China buys more than 25% of the oil that Saudi Arabia exports. If priced in yuan, those sales would boost the standing of China's currency. The Saudis are also considering including yuan-denominated futures contracts, known as the Petro Yuan, in the pricing model of Aramco.
续大量进口原油，扩大进口液化天然气，加强油气上游开发、工程服务、储运炼化合作，充分利用上海石油天然气交易中心平台，开展油气贸易人民币结算。
Online social media posts on this topic were so much that we couldn't even keep up with the different reactions. Taking a look at the visit itself, which was not covered as much in the Western media, it was very evident that people took notice of the fact that the Chinese president was in Saudi Arabia with a reception from not just Saudi Arabia, but also countries of the Persian Gulf, showing the importance that China has placed on its currency, the yuan, and how it wants to internationalize it. Let's take a look at some of these posts in order to see what I'm saying. First up, Xi Jinping says in speech in Saudi Arabia that his country will make full use of the Shanghai Petroleum and National Gas Exchange to carry out yuan settlement of oil and gas trade. Next post, great achievement for a peaceful and diverse multilateral world. Next, dollar has ended. Alert. Next post, time for the U.S. to cut off Saudi defense purchases and open the Iranian oil taps. Then, our final post, we can't say it, is going to hit the fan, is going to be the end of the fake petrodollar and the rogue printing thereof of a currency that is absolutely useless, not linked to gold or silver, but linked to someone else's asset, Arab oil.
Petroleum. See, what's important here is that the Biden administration has drained the strategic oil reserves in the United States. And the only way to get it back is by purchasing cheap Russian oil. And then Putin says, sorry.
Okay, there you had it. Those were some of the posts that we picked. Let me introduce our guest for this edition of Economic Divide. Matthew Ehret, Senior Fellow at the American University in Moscow, joins us. He's also an editor-in-chief of the Canadian Patriot Review. And he's the author of Clash of the Two Americas. In addition, he's the founder of the Rising Tide Foundation. All right, quite a resume there. Matthew Ehret, welcome to Economic Divide. When we take a look at the visit by the Chinese President Xi Jinping, very well received. Saudi Arabia and the Persian Gulf Arab countries at the same time receiving China and its president. They want to buy oil and gas. Well, China has proposed that in the yuan, and that establishes Beijing's goal to internationalize the yuan and also weaken the U.S.'s grip on the dollar. Why would the Chinese president make such a request, payment in yuan, do you think?
China and Xi Jinping right now are very much committed to the development of the Belt and Road Initiative as their primary means of attaining not only friendships, but also global security and development. It is the biggest multidimensional infrastructure project in history, and their commitment right now is to create a viable new architecture, which is outside of the influence and control of the IMF, the World Bank, the Anglo-American establishment, which seeks only hegemony at this point. So right now, China needs a lot of petroleum, a lot of crude oil, natural gas. That is a desperate component of their orientation. At the Arab Peninsula supplies China. They purchase. They're the world's largest oil importer. Half of that comes from the Arab Peninsula. A quarter of that comes from, as a whole, Saudi Arabia. And so China needs partners who actually care about their own survival and their own self-interest, which is not something that they've discovered they could find from, at the moment, the Anglo-American establishment, which cares only about dominance and subverting any possible power structure that could arise. So China, being it that they have now created $30 billion that they've signed in trade deals with Saudi Arabia and other Gulf states, increasingly that's even more, they are working to guarantee those supply lines and also make sure that that zone of instability, which has been a zone of geopolitical turmoil for many, many decades due to Anglo-American influence, becomes a zone featuring Belt and Road projects development, which they are offering to all of the Gulf states as well as the broader Southwest Asia. And that is something that I think a lot of the leaders of Southwest Asia are looking at, hopefully seeing that maybe there's a viable new game in town that involves taking their genuine, authentic self-interest into account instead of playing one against another for geopolitical purposes.
All right, thank you so much for that. Let me introduce our next guest. Qinduo joins us. He's a political commentator at the Pangal Institution. Qinduo, welcome to Economic Divide. Any move by Saudi Arabia to actually move ahead and ditch the dollar in its oil trade would be very damaging for the U.S. and its economy. It is said that it's going to actually decimate the U.S. economy because of the exchange that happens there. To what degree do you think the U.S. economy would suffer if such a move was actually turned out to be a realization, which is what the Chinese president wants to, in essence, do?
Well, I think the U.S. is suffering from their own action, from their own, obviously, lack of commitment, because in a sense, the U.S. provides this public goods, for the use of U.S. dollar by other countries, in particular in the deals of buying and selling of oil internationally. We know 80% of those transactions is done through U.S. dollars. But because of the U.S., their own action of freezing the foreign reserve of other countries, that's has sent a chilling, obviously, message to many countries. If you are seen by Washington as not that loyal to Washington, or if you refuse to toe the line of Washington, and then there's a danger Washington will punish you. For example, by through the use of U.S. dollar. And of course, the use of U.S. dollar or the U.S. financial system is one of the pillars for the U.S. empire. We know, along with other pillars, for example, the U.S. military or the U.S. tech prowess or the U.S. economy, largest one in the world. So, I mean, if there's one pillar that's being weakened, so that means the U.S. Dominant position around the world will be weakened. But it's mostly because of the United States, not because of other countries.
It's time now for the Info News section of the program. This is where we review economic news from around the world, and this is the new year, so let's see what we have going. Some of these news, of course, could be from just recently before the year to have ended. First up, the Russian President Vladimir Putin is saying no. What is he saying no to? Well, he has banned all oil sales to price cap states. That's now confirmed. The move is in response to a Western coalition price limit on Russia's seaborne oil exports. Now, under this price cap, which took effect on December the 5th, but it took a while for Russia to actually confirm it, oil traders must promise not to pay above $60 per barrel. Now, Russia's ban would halt crude sales to countries participating in the price cap, which will start from February 1, July 2023. That's another 6 or 7 months. Why would it start then? Great question. We'll have to find that out and relay it to you. Next up, looking at how every cent is being counted. Whose case is that? Well, it belongs to wealthy Americans. They are spending less. Millionaires in that country are becoming more budget conscious as a result of inflation. No surprise there. However, for the millionaires to be budget conscious, that's a surprise. 80% of these millionaire respondents who have investable assets of $1 million or more have been questioned, and they are saying that they're being cautious about the money that they're spending. Taking a look at Germany, we've focused on Germany and its economy. In this case, I don't want to say downfall, but Germany is facing a serious risk of going into bankruptcy, believe it or not. And it's due to the inability to find a solution to the current energy crisis. No surprise there, we've said that time and again, but obviously it's reached a critical point, if it's not beyond that. Infrastructure, energy prices, and the inability of the German government to actually pay for its, basically, in essence, its expenses is what's driving Germany towards bankruptcy. Okay, so obviously a big concern there for Germany. And finally, we take a look at the U.S. in terms of recession calls in that country. This was such a huge deal in terms of the prediction that was made that we decided to pick the topic again. Economists have placed 70% chance for U.S. recession for the year 2023, which we're in now. The probability of a downturn for this year has climbed from what used to be 65% odds back in November, and now it's more than double what it was 6 months ago. Now, the median estimates see the gross domestic product of the U.S. averaging, I want to make sure I'm looking at this correctly, averaging a paltry 0.3% for next year. That may sound actually very little, which it is in essence, but for a country of that size, it's not that small. However, it's something that the U.S. needs to watch out for in terms of sliding into a recession, which many say actually the U.S. is in one already. So this particular topic, just so you know, is something that we're going to cover in about a couple weeks' time, so do tune in for that. Those were the topics we picked for the Info News section. Again, it's great if you can send us a topic from wherever you are, in whichever part of the world. We would really appreciate it. Contact information is on your screens now. It's time now for the in-depth section of the program. It's called the dawn of the Petro Yuan era. When the Chinese president visited Saudi Arabia, he made sure that the Saudi crown prince understood what he was there for, and he meant business, one without the use of the dollar, at least for now. Well, Xi promised to import crude oil in a consistent manner and in large quantities from the GCC countries of the Persian Gulf. Of course, that includes Saudi Arabia, and that does also include natural gas. But Xi Jinping made an offer that was difficult for Saudi Arabia to ignore. It would be guaranteed buyers of oil and gas, but China would pay in yuan. Now, the Chinese President Xi also said that China and Persian Gulf nations should make full use of the Shanghai Petroleum and the National Gas Exchange as a platform to carry out yuan settlement of oil and gas trade. Now, Beijing promised to import crude oil in a consistent manner and in large quantities from these Persian Gulf countries. The internationalization of the yuan, that was what China's goal was. And to make sure that that message was conveyed, It signed over $30 billion in deals with Saudi Arabia during this trip, which would involve payments, you guessed it, in the yuan. Next, Xi Jinping and his large Chinese delegation of officials and business leaders who met with the leaders of the Gulf Cooperation Council of the Persian Gulf to promote increased trade. Now that means expanding the trading scope, praising increased strategic or commercial partnerships across the GCC, complete with the 5G communication, hello Huawei, new energy, and space and digital economy. These were all included, and yes, payments to be made in the yuan. China wants to push out the dollar slowly, so it's going to do trade and, of course, pay in yuan, and it will use this route to do that instead of all in one swoop with oil and gas. Now, like a slow-moving train, the BRICS Plus, the SCO, and the EAEU have all been energized and will be the conduit for trade minus the dollar. The SCO, Shanghai Cooperation Organization, for example, has 40% of the world's population. Then comes the payment systems, which would exclude SWIFT. Both Russia and China have widened the accessibility of their systems in order to process transactions. And for the final blow to the dollar, international cards will be used, replacing the dominant Western cards like Visa, MasterCard, and American Express. This means bye-bye to the dollar sanctions, and this would be in full synchronicity with Riyadh.
The Russian foreign minister said it himself.
And he could not have been more straightforward. Quote, the work has accelerated in the transition to national currencies in mutual settlements. Sound familiar? He also said the process of creating a common payment infrastructure and integrating national systems for the transmission of financial information has begun. What do you think? Do you think he said it best? Let's find out what our guests think. Let me reintroduce them. Matt Ehret, Senior Fellow at the American University in Moscow, rejoins us. Matt Ehret, welcome back. Taking a look at China's growing influence when it comes to the West Asia region, in particular Persian Gulf countries. Well, obviously, the U.S. is sitting idly by, very nervous. Add to that other countries who, in essence, are moving away from the U.S., leaving the U.S. somewhat out in the cold, especially moving away from the U.S. dollar. How worried should the U.S. be?
The U.S., as it stands, is very worried, obviously. There are geopolitical grand strategists losing a lot of sleep over the fact that the BRICS Plus nations are growing. Increasingly, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Algeria, Turkey are increasingly jumping on board more and more with this new system that involves not only the BRICS Plus, but also the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, which has been putting online not only a new financial architecture with payments being settled in yuan as well as local currencies. India is increasingly on board, so is Pakistan, so is Iran, ever more. But you also have a security component as well, which involves a very different philosophy of thinking about the respective nation states and different national and also civilizational forces as mutual partners in common interest orientation, projects that benefit everybody in a win-win philosophy, which is very different from the Hobbesian zero-sum thinking, which has really poisoned the spirit and minds of those making policy in Western governments, and that's been going on for far too long. So there is, I think, a lot of fear that this system is something that they cannot disrupt as easily as they used to. And the fact is the current system of the West is collapsing. And as the banking system does melt down, that gives them a lot less tools. And I'm talking now of the Anglo-American establishment. A lot less weapons are available for destabilizing governments you don't like. So on the one hand, it is something that is scary for them. But at the other hand, I think it is a bit of a wake-up call for those who need to realize that the world does not work in a zero-sum Hobbesian fashion and works very differently, which is a good thing, ultimately.
All right, let's find out what Qinduo Zhu thinks. He's a political commentator from the Pango Institution. Qinduo Zhu, welcome back. Taking a look at China, its influence in the West Asia region is obviously flourishing, especially with this visit by Xi Jinping. And countries are moving away from the U.S. and the U.S. dollar, for that matter. How worried should the U.S. be about this?
Well, I think it's really, as I said, up to Washington to make some wise and long-term policy in terms of their relationship with this regional powers. For example, their relationship with the Arab countries, including Saudi Arabia, their relationship with Iran, their relationship with basically very important elements in this region. For China, China is not seeking to dethrone the United States as a dominant power globally originally. For China, whatever business, China sees it through long term. That is, you have to do it in a win-win cooperational means. Because if you do business simply for your own sake and you don't consider or take into consideration of interests of the other party, and that kind of deal will not endure, will not be sustainable. So China chooses to cooperate with countries like Saudi Arabia, with Iran, with other Arab countries. If you look at the content of cooperation, it's really about infrastructure. It's about energy cooperation. It's about renewable energy. So in that sense, it's both sides will benefit from such cooperation. And even the U.S. will benefit from, better infrastructure, for example, in Saudi Arabia and in this region. So no, China is not competing with the U.S. or not driving the U.S. out of this region. It's really up to the U.S. U.S. is focusing on security, focusing on selling arms to these countries, profiting from selling arms, profiting from even tension in this region. That's not sustainable because this region, countries in this region, and people in this region, they deserve a better life. They deserve security. They deserve development. And China is here to play that kind of a role. I think that explains why China is popular, why China is welcomed, by Arab countries and other countries in this region.
It would be a profound shift if Saudi Arabia and China go ahead with their plans to ditch the US dollar in their mutual business relations. The global standing of the US dollar is partly grounded on the fact that it plays a pivotal role in global oil transactions. Even if some of Saudi Arabia's crude exports is traded in anything other than the US dollar, it would significantly weaken the status of the US currency. The majority of global oil sales are done in dollars, and the Saudis have traded oil exclusively in dollars since the year 1974. That was part of a deal struck between the Saudis and the Nixon administration that included security guarantees for the kingdom. Furthermore, Saudi Arabia has defied U.S. pressure to limit dealings with China and break with fellow OPEC Plus oil producer Russia, and in turn China has stepped up its support for the kingdom, including helping Saudi Arabia's missile and nuclear programs. Saudi relations with the U.S. has been frosty in recent years since President Joe Biden had vowed to make Riyadh a pariah state during his campaign for the killing of Jamal Khashoggi. The U.S. economic relationship with the Saudis is diminishing. This could further weaken the U.S. dominance in the West Asia region.
In conclusion, the rise of China, India, Iran, ASEAN, and Eurasia and West Asia, they're here. ASEAN may actually displace the EU as the world's most powerful economic bloc. Now, India and China will utterly, which is predicted is going to happen, will crush the Anglosphere economically in the BRICS Plus formation, which will include Saudi Arabia and Iran, just to name a couple. Russia, Venezuela, China, Saudi Arabia, and Iran, as part of OPEC, will control the oil and gas. All of this would then leave the Western and U.S. grip out in the cold. Countries are just tired of the U.S. using the dollar as a weapon, which all means that the U.S. dollar would lose its supremacy. That does it for this edition of Economic Divide. Really enjoyed having you on board for this program. Do send us your comments and questions. Contact information is behind me. For me, Kaveh and the team, it's goodbye until the next program.